So good afternoon. My name is Daniel Sokatch. I'm your moderator for this panel. I'm also, in my day job, the CEO of the New Israel Fund, which is the leading organization working for equality, peace, and justice for all Israelis and all who live under Israeli control. We are here today to meet and speak with a group of extraordinary authors who have put together a book which you will be able to purchase and get signed in the lobby after the panel is done. And before I introduce them, let me just say a few other words of introduction. I want to first thank the festival for having us in Freight and Salvage, which for those of you who are Bay Area natives know is the best folk bluegrass blues venue in the area. And I live on the other side of the bay, but I know that to be true. And I also want to thank our dear friend Ann Germanicos, who along with my organization, the New Israel Fund, is the co-sponsor of this really extraordinary event featuring some of the greatest authors anywhere who are writing about one of the most complex and challenging issues anywhere. So thank you very much, Ann, wherever you are sitting out there. The occupation, Israel's military rule over the lives of millions of Palestinians, is this month, June 2017, 50 years old. Of course, this was the immediate, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War 50 years ago, this was the immediate and largest consequence. One that, at the time, if you've been following the fascinating articles in virtually every newspaper and journal over the last few weeks, did not register on the world radar or the Israeli radar, let alone the Palestinian radar, in a way that would suggest the import it has held 5 decades later. The occupation hangs like a cloud over much of Israel, eroding democratic values and poisoning relationship between Jews and Arabs, as well as, obviously, making it impossible for an ordinary development of Palestinian society and Palestinian life. And of course, undermining prospects for peace. No problem as big as the occupation will ever be solved by sweeping it under the rug, by shunting it to the side, and by not addressing it head on. New Israel Fund, my organization, is an organization that works to build a better Israel for everybody. And we take as one of the primary areas of focus not only building shared society between Palestinians and Jews, but also at confronting the occupation and supporting those Israelis and Palestinians who are working peacefully and nonviolently to attempt to end it. This is a topic, of course, that has become one of extraordinary controversy in the Jewish community and beyond. And no one is more familiar with this than those Israelis who actively work to end occupation, and perhaps even more significantly, to bring it to the fore of the Israeli debate. Because in Israel, one of the great successes of the hard nationalist right is in really taking this conversation off the table, so that you can live in Tel Aviv or in Haifa and really dismiss or ignore what's happening only a few kilometers away from where you live. Now, in 2004, in order to speak out about what was going on in the occupied territories and to wake up Israelis to what they were sanctioning, what was being done in their name, a group of former Israeli combat soldiers who'd served in the territories created a nonprofit organization, Breaking the Silence, Shovrim Shtika in Hebrew. And we're very proud at New Israel Fund to have supported them since practically their inception. I will appreciate that one clap there. Thank you. It's not always like that in these kinds of audiences. When members of Breaking the Silence met the novelist and essayist Ayelet Waldman at the Jerusalem Writers' Festival in 2014, they invited her to a tour of Hebron, or Hebron, a city of more than 200,000 Palestinians. I believe the pronunciation is bad, but Al-Khalil in Arabic. Someone correct me if I butchered it, which I believe means the friend, which is another irony. In Hebron, there are about 200,000 Palestinians. It's the largest city in the West Bank. In the midst of them live several hundred, about 650 Israeli settlers, right in the middle of the city. Next to the city is one of the oldest settlements in the West Bank called Kiryat Arba. But right in the center of the old city of Hebron, 600 or so settlers who are fairly radical and very religious live, protected by hundreds of soldiers who are there to protect them, and who do so by having radically changed the face of the inner core of Hebron. We'll hear more about that as we speak. What Ayelet saw on this tour disturbed her greatly. And she later described the events to her husband, the author Michael Chabon, and they both came to understand that they wanted to do something to change and draw attention to the situation. And then they realized that storytelling itself, as they put it, bearing witness in vivid and clear language to things personally seen and incidents encountered, has the power to engage the attention of people like us who had long since given up paying attention or have simply given up. So working with Breaking the Silence and other local Palestinian and Israeli activists, Michael and Ayelet invited 24 acclaimed writers from around the world to visit the West Bank and Gaza and to share what they saw with the world. Over 2 years, these authors came and they saw and they wrote and they told their stories, and the result is this remarkable anthology, Kingdom of Olives and Ash, Writers Confront the Occupation. It is an unflinching, very painful, often difficult to read set of testimonies from the ground level about the human consequences of an occupation that is often seen from afar as one of the great intractable, unsolvable situations, and so often pushed to the side, shunted off the table of the conversation. So with no further ado, let me introduce the authors who are here to speak with us today. First, I'd like to introduce Ayelet Waldman. Ayelet, really, I believe the engine and inspiration for this project, is the author of the book, A Really Good Day, How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life. It's really good, and I recommend that you read that one too. And of the novels, Love and Treasure, Red Hook Road, Love and Other Impossible Pursuits, and Daughter's Keepers, as well as many essays, including a collection, Bad Mother, I just love the name, a chronicle of maternal crimes, minor calamities, and occasional moments of grace. She's the editor of Inside This Place, Not of It, Narratives from Women's Prisons, and she lives in Berkeley with her family. She and her husband, Michael, edited this book, and so I'd like to introduce you to him. Michael Chabon, come on out. Michael's the author of many novels, among them his latest, Moonglow, which I also read, and I also urge you to read, Telegraph Avenue, Yiddish Policeman's Union, and my favorite, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, for which he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. And he lives, not surprisingly, in Berkeley with his family. Now the other authors. So next is Fida Jiryis. Come on out. Fida is a Palestinian from the Galilee living now in Ramallah. It's a fascinating story, and I intend to ask you a lot more about that when we get started. She's contributed short stories and articles to various publications, including This Week in Palestine, Mondoweiss, The Palestinian Chronicle, and 972 magazine. She's the author of 2 books of short stories on village life in the Galilee, which in English are known as Our Small Life and The Gentleman. And I'm very excited that she is working on a memoir, which I think is entitled My Return to Galilee, because she and her family were the first Israelis to return to Israel proper from outside, from the West Bank, after the Oslo Accords. A fascinating and unique perspective. Rachel Kushner is next. Please welcome her. Rachel is the author of 2 novels, The Flamethrowers and Telex from Cuba, both finalists for the National Book Award, as well as a book of short stories, The Strange Case of Rachel Kay, and she lives in Los Angeles. Finally, I want to introduce you to Yehuda Shaul. Yehuda, who was born and raised in Jerusalem, come on out, Yehuda, in an ultra-Orthodox family, and who graduated from a yeshiva, a religious high school, in an Israeli settlement in the West Bank, served in the IDF as a platoon commander, platoon sergeant for the 50th Battalion of the Nachal Brigade from 2001 to 2004 in the West Bank towns of Bethlehem and Hebron. And if that date sounds familiar, it's because you were paying attention earlier when I told you that Breaking the Silence, Shovrim Shtika, was founded in 2004 by Yehuda, who founded the organization with a group of fellow veterans and currently serves as the co-director of the organization. He's studying political science now at the Open University in Israel. And I will say, having gone at least 3 times with Yehuda on the trip that Ayelet took to Hebron. It is a worthy and powerful thing to do, and I urge you all to take advantage of it if you find yourself over on that side of the ocean. So, with no further ado, I'm going to try to work my way over to my chair. See if this works. There's a lot of us. And let me start with a question for you two, for Michael and Ayelet.
Yes.
There's a question I think that everybody would like to ask, and or at least I would like to ask it.
Okay.
And it's not just necessarily the obvious one of how did you come up with the idea to do this. I mentioned a little bit of that in my introduction. I would like to hear a bit about that process. How did two people who have been able to disconnect from this issue for a while suddenly find themselves needing to talk about it? And I know that you're two very different people, so that's part of that story. But also, I'm really curious, how did you select your authors? And in particular, what made you decide to put a premium, or at least to emphasize, non-Israeli or Palestinian authors? There are Israeli and Palestinian authors in the book, but I'm very curious what your process was for thinking about who would tell these stories.
So let me start very briefly with sort of how it came out, and then we'll answer the second question. So it was, in part, the trip to Hebron that I took, but, you know, I wrote an essay after that was published in The Atlantic, and that might have satisfied my need to take a stand, to express my experience. What made me feel like I wanted to be part of this project was when I was in Tel Aviv, and how many of you have been to Tel Aviv? It's a lovely city. You know, the weather's great, the food's amazing, the people are stylish, there are gay families everywhere. It feels very, and for me, I was born in Israel, and it felt very comfortable, very at home. I had a wonderful time. I, you know, stayed out till 3 in the morning with writer friends, and, you know, got stoned on the beach and all the wonderful things that you do in Tel Aviv, and felt great, felt at home, felt at ease, and that's what made me realize that I had to do this project, because I could not feel that sense of belonging without feeling a simultaneous sense of responsibility. And I couldn't feel like this was a place I wanted to be or visit without feeling like I had to also take responsibility for the atrocities committed as in my name and in the name of all of the people who live there. So the book came as a result of that feeling, a feeling that Yehuda took incredibly sophisticated advantage of, but you know,
he does that of all of us. That's his talent.
We met when I was in Tel Aviv, having that flush of excitement and then ambivalence, and he said, "I have a project in mind. What do you think about doing something like this?" And then I came. You know, I thought immediately, terrific. That's exactly what I want to do. You know, the honest truth is, the first thing I thought was, because I'd done a Voice of Witness book for the Women in Prison book, which is Voice of Witness is a series of books that illuminates different human rights crises around the world. My first thought was, let's do a Voice of Witness Palestine, oral history, their first person narratives, oral histories. And I called up Dave Eggers and I said, let's do Voice of Witness Palestine. And he said, I'm so ahead of you, that's coming out next year. So that, all right, that's coming out. Great. What else can we do? And that's really why we chose to cast our net wide. I mean, we were looking for writers. We knew we wanted Israeli writers. We knew we wanted Palestinian writers. But mostly we were looking for storytellers whose work we loved, whose eye we appreciated, who we knew could bring something special. I mean, and sometimes what we also wanted people to be perfectly honest, who brought an audience, and an unusual audience, to the project. I mean, our goal in a way was for people who say love the work of Rachel Kushner, but haven't thought about Palestine, or averted their eyes maybe even from Palestine and Israel, to say, I'll read anything Rachel Kushner writes. So I'm going to read this, and then suddenly you're engaging with the subject matter in a new way.
Yes.
Well, I would have read the book anyway, but I felt that way when I saw the list of authors. I thought I would read anything that they wrote, and so well done.
I mean, we have been asked over the course of the especially last week since the book has been out, why aren't there more Israeli writers in the book? Why aren't there more Palestinian writers in the book? Why are there so many writers from outside of Israel, Palestine? And I don't know if that's not what you were asking, but it is a common question. And the answer is we invited lots of Israeli writers, and we invited lots of Palestinian writers, and some of them couldn't participate for scheduling reasons. They had deadlines. Some of them missed their deadlines.
Not the Palestinian, the Israeli writers missed their deadline.
And some of them had other reasons for not wanting to participate, that we didn't inquire into beyond accepting their declining our invitation. That wasn't. The idea wasn't to sort of minimize the participation in any way of either Israeli or Palestinian writers at all. We cast our net wide, like Ayelet said. But we did think it was important to have a lot of writers from outside of Israel and Palestine because, I think one thing we were almost unconsciously hoping for that then began to pay off as soon as we when we were in the group of writers we were in that also included Rachel, was there were writers coming from parts of the world where, believe it or not, the Israel-Palestine question just isn't quite as important.
Yeah, we forget that sometimes.
Right. And people who knew vaguely what it was maybe kind of all about or what was happening and maybe had kind of a vague opinion about it, but really didn't know much at all. And we saw a lot of value, and we think we found a lot of value in having these people come who are incredibly acute observers, who make their way in the world by noticing things, looking at details, who are amazing storytellers who can write beautiful sentences, and having these people with no real preconceptions, with no real biases, come in and see this situation on the ground in Palestine with these kind of fresh eyes. And I think a lot of the pieces in the book really reflect that.
Yeah, I think so too. And I found that one of the things that was particularly powerful about the book is that, you have some people, like Fida, who are like intimately familiar with what's going on. Then you have people like Rachel and people from all over the world who really, maybe it's their first time. Please.
Me very little, frankly.
Right, who are less familiar with it. And I think what is really powerful is the sort of drumbeat of similar observation. When you get to the granular human level, what people are observing, divorced sort of from a political analysis that we all might have.
Sure.
They're just writing about what they're seeing.
And you have, in Chabon, for example, like here are the tombs of the patriarchs. Here they are. And to have someone standing there who says, yeah, and
right.
So what's so important, what's so great about that? But look over there, why are those doors welded shut?
Yeah.
And the whole street is devoid of people. I think that is an important perspective.
What was the reaction of the authors, especially the ones who were not so familiar with the situation there? What was the response?
It varied. It was,
everyone had their own response, but there's certain places that the responses were very similar. When you're standing, say, at a checkpoint, the Kalandia checkpoint, and you're watching thousands of people desperately trying to get through this checkpoint in order to get to work. And the checkpoint is designed specifically and consciously to dehumanize and humiliate them and to make that process of moving from one side to the other as difficult as possible. The response across the board was a kind of horror. I mean, it looks like a cattle chute. It doesn't have to look that way. We've all been to the airport. We know what every one of us has been through a checkpoint. The way that those checkpoints look is very specifically designed to evoke feelings of despair. And I think that was one of the moments where everybody had the same response, which was just horror.
Yeah, I think that actually, one of the things that is not necessarily apparent about the situation for the last 50 years in the West Bank and the occupation and settlement enterprise, right, which is the real engine of the occupation, the reason for it, is the way in which occupation, a half-century long occupation, is done. And I felt that many of the essays really captured this. And I want to move to ask you guys some questions. Before I do, I want, Michael, in your essay about your travels with Sam Bahor, this extraordinary guy who you describe as a giant in the cage, right? Mm-hmm. You sort of conclude your piece by saying, I'll paraphrase, clumsily, right? Mm-hmm. It is the non-dramatic aspects of occupation that are actually its greatest strategies, mm-hmm. right? And the thing that struck me in your essay, but also in a number of other ones, is the way that essayists, including Palestinians, thought about the question of time. How when you can't control your time, mm-hmm. that's really the victory. Can you sort of talk just a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, Sam Bahor is Youngstown, Ohio, born and raised, American businessman of half Palestinian descent. His father's Palestinian. His mother was, I think, a second-generation Lebanese Maronite Christian. He went to his paternal ancestral homeland after Oslo with this vision of creating the first wireless cellular telephone network in Palestine, which he ultimately did accomplish. But he's very eloquent on the subject of time as an instrument, time control as an instrument of power. And he gave me many examples in the course of the time I spent with him. But, I think one that actually takes into account what Ayelet was just talking about, too, is he's talking about, so he needs to make business appointments to meet with both Israeli business people and people coming from outside Israel who are coming to Israel, and he needs to go sit down with them and negotiate whatever it is. He's been in real estate development, he's been in supermarket project management, and so on. To do that, to make a simple business appointment, he has to apply for a special permit just so he can cross over. And this is a man with an American passport, by the way. He has to he can only get a vague time slot, like he can't tell the people, I'll meet you at 12:30. He has to be between 12 and 5 or whatever it might be. He has to be back by a specific time. This permit's only good for one day. He has to apply for it in person. And this is all just to make the most rudimentary kind of thing that anybody here would take for granted. Like you call somebody up, say, I'll meet you, you text them. And then he has to pass through this checkpoint. The very one that Ayelet was talking about. And Sam has diabetes. And as Sam says, when you have diabetes, one of the things you have to do fairly frequently is urinate. And when you're standing in this line and you're just squeezed down in single file and he's halfway through this line, and there's a whole bunch of people in front of him and there's a whole bunch of people behind him, and suddenly he needs to use a bathroom.
It's a chute.
Yeah, he's 6 foot 6 inches tall. So he's stooped and he's in this thing and he has to pee. Well, what is he going to do? He'll lose his place in line if he goes this way. He can't tell the people from, oh, excuse me, I need to pee, so let me cut the line and go ahead of all of you. It's so inconvenient and actually discomforting that he'll just screw it, I just won't take the meeting today.
So he's effectively imprisoned because of that checkpoint. But Fida has...
Yeah, that's my next question. Mm-hmm. So Michael, your essay is called Man in a Cage, or Giant in a Cage, yeah. Right? And you describe the cage. Fida brings this really unique perspective. When I read your essay, I thought, wow, here you are, a woman who was born in the state of Israel, Palestine. You were born outside the state of Israel. You come to Galilee. You become a citizen of the state of Israel, and then you choose to move to Ramallah. So you bring at least 3 perspectives, and probably many, many more, to this issue of occupation and of what it's like to try to have a life, right? And what it means for this 50-year occupation in terms of a person who is crossing through these sectors. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that perspective, the unique perspective that you bring to this issue. And in particular, as I said earlier on, and I promise we will all buy the book, even if you spoil what you're writing in it for us now. But I'm really fascinated by this notion that after Oslo, you go back in. So I know that we only have a few minutes, but if you could tell us your life story and your perspective, that would be very helpful because I think it's utterly unique.
So thank you, everyone, for coming. I always tell people it's difficult to tell my story without telling my dad's story. My father's name is Jiryis. He was, or he is a lawyer, and he was one of the founders of one of the first Palestinian resistance movements in the 1950s, 1960s. Of course, he was born in 1938 in what was then Palestine, in a village called Fassuta in the Galilee. We are only about 7 kilometers from the Lebanese border, so we're way, way up north. As a result of and he carried on. He went to the Terra Sancta school in Nazareth, and he went on to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he studied law. At the time, all the Palestinians in Israel were living under military governance, which basically meant that to move anywhere, you had to have permits, which today is like the situation in the West Bank. He carried on. He became a political activist. He studied law. He was working to prevent the seizure of Arab lands by the newly created State of Israel. Of course, at the time, we had close to 1 million people, 85% of the Palestinian population of what had become Israel at the time, had been displaced to Lebanon, Syria, and the surrounding countries in a massive refugee crisis. He was working to try to save the lands of those who remained. As a result of his work, he was being detained and hustled, and ultimately he was exiled. He had to leave to Lebanon, where I was born. He worked as the director of the Palestine Research Center of the PLO, working on political, social research and so on. And in 1982, there was the Israeli invasion of Beirut. In 1983, I lost my mother, who worked with him in the Palestine Research Center, in a bombing, that was targeting the center at the time. We moved to Cyprus. We stayed there until 1994, and then in a turn of events, none of us had actually even thought would happen. The Oslo Accords were signed, and I remember we were all sitting in our living room in Nicosia in Cyprus, staring at the TV in shock at the historic handshake between, Mr. Rabin and Mr. Arafat at the time. And sure enough, a year later, for the first time, we could go back to the Galilee, which of course was an incredible homecoming because, no one had ever expected from our family, from our village, that we'd be able to go back home. My father was welcomed back with a dance. It was huge. So a year later, our family relocated to Israel. And of course, I came to Israel with these romantic notions that I was coming back home to Palestine. I wasn't coming home to Palestine. I effectively became an Israeli citizen. And there was nobody else like me who actually made this trip back, having grown up as a Palestinian all their life suddenly, and gone through the war in Lebanon and what it meant. Suddenly found themselves an Israeli citizen having to learn Hebrew and integrate in Israeli society and start finding out what it meant to live as a Palestinian, in a state that treats us as second. I hesitate to even use second. It's probably third or fourth or 10th class citizens. With me, I have, just a few of, the racist laws that are constantly passed against us to try and, marginalize the Palestinian population and so on. I stuck it out for 8 years, and then I ran away to Canada. I was in Canada for 6 years. I said, forget it.
We may all follow you soon enough.
I said, I'm not doing this, I have to leave. And then, I missed home, and one of my friends suggested, why don't you come back to the West Bank, to Ramallah? You could get a job, you could still be, fairly near your family and so on. So I came back and I lived in Ramallah. I've been there since 2009. So the thing is, I'm one of those people who has this view of what it means to live as a Palestinian, both in Israel and in the West Bank. And one of the things that I said in my essay is that, as Palestinians, we feel we spend every minute of our lives in the country paying for the fact that we're not Jewish. Whether it's in the West Bank or inside Israel, there is a very complex, intricate system of discrimination that's like a web around, every aspect of our lives. And being, I mean, the Columbia checkpoint that Ayelet and Michael have talked about, I traverse this every time I want to go back to Israel to visit my family, to visit my friends, and so on. I just want to say something just very quickly. Recently, we had, for example, a deputy Knesset speaker, Bezalel Smotrich, I think that's how you say it, from Habayit HaYehudi, talked about something called the Subjugation Plan for the West Bank, in which he says that the Palestinians, according to him, will be given 3 choices: to leave the country, in other words, for mass displacement again, to live in Israel with the status of resident alien, because, as he noted, according to Jewish law, there must always be some inferiority, or to resist, and then, to quote him, the Israel Defense Forces will know what to do. When they were asked, when he was asked if he was talking about genocide, he said, well, in war, you have to behave as in war. And I know this must sound, really shocking, but these kind of statements we're used to. They come out all the time. We have an organization called Adala. It means justice in Arabic. This actually documents a database of discriminatory laws that are passed by, or attempted to pass in the Israeli parliament against us. I mean, very briefly, the expulsion of Arab members of Knesset. The other members, the Jewish Israeli members of Knesset have the right to expel their fellow Arab Knesset members. We have the foreign funding law, which says if you're an NGO working for human rights, the state of Israel can clamp down on your funding and can close your organization. We have the anti-terror law, which, has a very vague definition of terror, so it allows you to be imprisoned on, very spurious grounds and on something called administrative detention, in which you have, no right to even know the charges that are against you because of, security. We have mandatory minimum sentences on convicted stone throwers, i.e. children. And we have laws revoking child allowances for the parents of these children who may be as young as, 10, 11, 12 years old. So I think, I'll finish here. There's too much I can say, but, I can tell you that every Jewish person must make an attempt, I think, to visit Israel and to see both sides.
So, do you want to?
Yeah, I am so grateful to Fida both for being in the book and being on the stage, and I think it's also, I want to thank the festival for bringing Fida here, because this is not a point of view that Jewish audiences, American audiences normally get to hear, and certainly not to hear on the same stage. So I'm just so glad you're here.
Thank you, Ayelet. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fida. One of the things that I find in my work running New Israel Fund is that we encounter a lot of cognitive dissonance. That is to say, there's virtually no other issue out there, right, that people have very strong received narratives about, when Israel-Palestine, the conflict. And depending on where we went to church or synagogue or who our parents were, where we get our news, we have these received narratives, and we are sure that what we know is right. And the cognitive dissonance that many of us encounter when we realize that story, when we are told that story is not all that we are sure we know. By the way, this is left, right, and center, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, everybody, when it comes to this issue, is something that I think is a big challenge for those of us who are trying to build bridges. And I think that one of the nice things about this panel is that after we hear the list of laws that we just heard are things that New Israel Fund is fighting against, and I can add to them. A law was recently passed that says that if you vocally oppose the settlement enterprise by calling for a boycott of settlements, we're not talking about BDS, we're not talking about a boycott of Israel, then you are to be denied entry into the state of Israel. So
on that point, this is being recorded. Michael Chabon, American citizen, arriving in Israel on June 17th, United Flight something or other, at approximately 9:30 p.m.
I support a boycott of the settlements.
Okay. All he wants is to stay home and finish his novel. So Bibi would be doing him such a favor if he turned him back at the border. So I promised him, he's on a tight deadline, that I would at least try to earn him a couple of weeks.
Nicely done. Right. So this conversation about the settlements and the occupation has gone from something, opposition to the settlement enterprise, has gone from being something that was the mainstay of the mainstream political opposition to something that has been sort of marginalized and now is being illegalized, right? The hope for me is that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Israelis who don't buy this line. And just like here in our country, the challenge is how do you mobilize and motivate that base of people who don't accept this. That's largely what the work of New Israel Fund is about. We have here one of the leaders of the camp of people who are not accepting this and who are pushing back. And Yehuda, I wonder if you would say a few words about what it's been like to be in the forefront of the Israeli movement to challenge the occupation, to force this conversation into the national conversation at a time when a government that's now been in power for almost a decade has done everything it can, including legislation, to try to stop the conversation.
I think what we're experiencing in the last 2 years, year and a half, is something we haven't had before. If you would come to me 10 years ago and tell me that as an organization of veterans who are working against the occupation, we're going to have security guards outside of our office in Tel Aviv, in the midst of Israel, I would probably laugh in your face, and we're there. We're there because after 50 years of occupation, most of us were born into it. Most of Israeli Jews don't know anything else. The worst about it is that most of us cannot even imagine something else, a reality where we don't control Palestinians, a reality where Palestinians are equal to us and we're equal to them. And in order to continue this reality, in order to erase, continue to erase the occupation from public political life, anyone who speaks out about occupation must be silenced from the highest levels of the government, from the prime minister through ministers, down to civil society groups that the settlers have established to basically bully anyone who speaks out. But to say the truth, I feel a bit weird to sit here as a Jewish Israeli from Jerusalem and talk about, the fact that our education minister is now trying to push through Parliament a bill called the Breaking the Silence Bill. That's how he calls it, in order to ban our presence in high schools. That's one of the things we do in Breaking the Silence. We go and meet Israeli youth before their military service and talk about our experiences in the occupied territories. And he's trying to make it illegal for us to appear in schools. To sit here and talk about the fact that our defense minister calls us spies and traitors, while Palestinians are living for 50 years without rights. While, I don't know if we can even, how many times we stop actually and think about the meaning of 50 years. I come from a religious background, and I think that, if we were in the days of the Bible, slaves would be free after 50 years. Like, that's how long 50 years is. Palestinians my age, many of them, haven't seen the sea in their life. So, talking about what happens to me, ultimately I come back home to my house in Jerusalem, and I stay there, and, everything is okay. No one bumps into my house 3 o'clock at night, tears apart my apartment, with a military unit. That's what we used to do in the occupied territories. In the IDF, we have a concept that we call making our presence felt. I don't know how many of you have heard about that. The idea in the IDF says this, that if Palestinians will get the feeling that the IDF is all the time everywhere, they'll be afraid to attack. So what do you do to make them feel this way? You make your presence felt. And in different parts of the occupied territories, it manifests itself in different ways. In a place like Hebron, where, Ayelet's visit started it all, we have 3 military patrols. That's their mission, to make our presence felt. I was there as a soldier and a commander for over a year. 24/7, that's what we do. You start your night shift patrol 10 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning. Walk in the streets of the old city, bump into a house. It's not a house we have intelligence about. It's a random house. The sergeant, the officer who leads the patrol, chooses the house. You bump into a house, wake up the family, search the place. You can yourself try to imagine what happens when a military unit would bump into your house 4 o'clock. Finish searching the place, go out to the street, knock on some doors, make some noise, run to the other corner of the street, invade another house, wake up the next family, search the place, climb to the roof, jump from one roof to another, go down through the balcony, wake up the next family. And that's how you pass your 8-hour shift. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. From September 2000, when the second Intifada started, till today, it didn't stop for 1 second. The idea is very simple. Every Palestinian needs to feel the military is right here. We're breathing down your neck. You never know when we're going to show up, how it's going to look like, when it's going to start, when it's going to end, how many we're going to be. It's to do what we call in the military to create the sense of being chased, of being pursued inside the Palestinian population. In a way, that's the only way to rule people for 5 decades against their will without giving them rights, is to make them fear you. And once they get used to a level of fear, you have to increase it, and it's a whole without about him. So that's the occupation, that's the story. Yes, after 50 years, it's also crossing the green line into Israel and destroying Israeli society and Israeli checks and balances, and Israeli structure. But first and foremost, it's 50 years that Palestinians live under this regime that we inflict.
So I want to, if you haven't read the book, I want to assure you that although we're having a really tough conversation, and it is hard to talk about and hear these things. It's hard for me, and this is what I do with my life, to talk about and hear these things. The book does have within it seeds of real hope because, frankly, of people like Fida and Yehuda who are working against all odds to try to repair the situation there. And we'll talk. I'd like to talk more about that so we don't all get too depressed before we stop. But first, Rachel, I mentioned to you back in the green room that in this tough book full of deeply powerful and I think penetrating and painful essays about a place that so many of us really care deeply about, your essay really was, in a way, the hardest one for me to read. It's brilliant and beautiful, and there are even funny moments, including the one, when you point out that despite your name being Rachel Kushner, you're not actually Jewish or involved in Jewish community, despite the assumptions that I guess everybody must have about that. But I found, the thing about your essay, and I don't want to give it away, I want people to read it, is that it really is about the snuffing out of what little hope people are able to build in incredibly dark circumstances. So I wonder, you as a person who sort of parachutes into the situation as a sensitive, intelligent observer and storyteller about humanity, do you leave with a sense of hope, given the real pain of what you witnessed? And if so, can you tell us where you find it? And if not, can you tell us what you're thinking now?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's a ready answer is not coming to me. Listening to the others speak, especially Yehuda, who was my real guide when I was there. People who've been in the military have immense knowledge about the structure and the logic of the occupation, but they also have incredible contacts with Palestinians in the West Bank. So we were taken all over and we saw many different kinds of things, and I was reminded of some of them, but I have to say, very hopeless things that I had witnessed. And when Yehuda was talking about soldiers going house to house, doing raids in the middle of the night, I remember talking to one soldier who told me that they would do raids to learn how to do raids. So they would raid a house as a military exercise. And for the parents in the room, and I am a parent myself, imagine if you could not make your child feel safe or protect your child and are subjected to this. This is like a total humiliation of the parent to be rendered impotent in your ability to make your child feel safe. Anyway, I won't go on and on about that. But I remember being taken to Ofer military court and prison, and it's a temporary structure that's been there apparently for 50 years. Ayelet wrote about it amazingly in the book. There are trailers that are surrounded by open canals of human shit. And families are waiting there all day to witness the military court tribunal of their relative. The proceedings happen in Hebrew. There's supposed to be a translator. The proceeding that I witnessed was of a Bedouin farmer who accidentally got on the wrong road. It was an Israeli road in his tractor. The Israeli military dismantled his tractor on the side of the road and destroyed it. But then they had him coming to court because they wanted him to possibly serve jail time and pay fines. And the proceedings happened very quickly without a translator. I don't even know what language this Bedouin farmer spoke, but he had no advocate there, and then it was over. And he was going to serve, I think, like a year of jail time and pay this extraordinary fee. So you see these things and then you move on. And as you said, we were kind of dropped in. I mean, parachuted, I took a plane, got off. But the context of it was like that in the sense that I got this letter from Ayelet and Michael that said, hey, you don't have to have a history or a political, geopolitical, social investment in this subject. There are many problems in the world. I live in Los Angeles. We have a lot there to focus on, frankly. But I got this letter saying, do you want to learn about this part of the world? This is what we're going to offer you in terms of an education. So it was, for me, impossible to say no to go there and encounter this whole world and learn as much as I possibly could. Given that, so I went without much foreknowledge, and then what I saw did not leave me feeling super hopeful. There is, at this point, really, I don't see an emancipatory horizon for Palestinian people. And I don't want to make sweeping generalizations about what the solutions should be. What I really saw were problems, and frankly came home feeling like I was losing my mind because of the load and the multiplicity of the different kinds of humiliations that I didn't really ask to witness, but witnessed and then had to find a way to process. And the person that I wrote about, something very, very tragic happened to him right after I left. And if you read the essay, you'll find out, or I don't know if it's a plot spoiler, but I went to a refugee camp where 80,000 people are forced to live in 1 square kilometer. 80,000.
80. She didn't say 8.
80,000 without services, without infrastructure, without legal water, electricity, roads, emergency medical or fire services, education, police, no land registration, no mail, really nothing. And there are people within that camp who try to build the very fragile and tenuous fabric of some kind of a society. But this is an impossible proposition for them to have to do that. So I don't know about hope, frankly.
Can I speak to one thing about that sort of hope question? So something that Yehuda phrased really well once when we were recently talking, they're broadly 2 subjects. One that we are involved in, that this book is about, and one that this book is not about. And that we don't involve, Michael and I certainly don't involve ourselves in, although others might. So the one we're not involved in, the one this book is not about, is the conflict. Israelis, Palestinian, all that. This book is about occupation. There are not 2 sides to an occupation. An occupation is illegal under the Geneva Conventions. This is a book about simply and purely the occupation. There is a very easy solution. Get out. Super simple, right? Obviously, blah, 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 we can talk about other things, but the very easy answer to the question of occupation is get out. Now, hope. Change is incremental and achingly slow until it suddenly isn't. I mean, I was a student activist in the 80s, sleeping in a shanty town in the middle of the Wesleyan campus talking about apartheid. In the mid-'80s, it seemed impossible to imagine an end to apartheid. And then suddenly, it was over. Similarly, who the hell thought the Berlin Wall was going to come down? And then suddenly, it was down. There is, I refuse to, Northern Ireland, 800 years of sectarian conflict, and then a peace agreement. So change can happen. But more importantly than that, in terms of the question of hope, and I think really relevant to all of us in this room, I don't know about you guys, but I've been having a really hard time since November. I get overwhelmed by depression, by fear, by powerlessness. And the only time I feel better is when I am actively engaged in the project of resistance. When I am at the airport protesting the travel ban on Muslim travelers. When I am, wearing a pink hat in the streets of Washington, D.C. That's when I personally feel better. So hope, schmope, resistance makes you feel better. And it can't hurt.
So I will just say that the very first text I got at the announcement of the travel ban was from you saying, where do we show up? So you definitely live it. You wanted to say something, and then I have another question for you.
I just wanted to say that the story, I think that the real story for me is to try to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Yeah, and taking responsibility and standing up is the way to do it. And thank you very much, Ayelet, for making this project happen. And thank you all for participating, and thank the New Israel Fund and all. I think now the question is on you. What are you going to do that we're not going to mark, that now by marking the 50 years of occupation, we're not starting to count the next 50 years, but we're starting to count the countdown to the end of occupation.
Amen.
I'll just say, none of these writers earned a dime from this project. Michael and I didn't take any money. All of the royalties are going to Breaking the Silence and to a Palestinian nonviolent human rights organization called Youth Against Settlements. So, buy a few copies of the book. That's super easy. You could do it today.
If you want hope, that's hope. Youth Against Settlements. A bunch of young Palestinian activists in Hebron in the midst of, the center of occupation with all what it means, dedicated themselves to a pure nonviolent struggle, welcome Israelis into their center and their homes, to try to build a better future. That's hope.
That's right. And hope is Adala, which Fida mentioned, one of our flagship grantees that are challenging these bad laws, that are representing Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank, and HOPE are organizations like B'Tselem, a human rights organization, Sikui, an organization working to build a truly shared society. So resistance and standing up and saying, I'm part of the solution, I think is a beautiful, and if I may say so, very NIF-y way of describing hope. We want to open up for questions. I have one last question that I really want to ask you, Ayelet, as a person who I sort of identify as, along with Michael, as the engine behind all of this. Your essay was, for me, really the heart and most powerful part of the book. And that's just, I like them all. But for me, what was so powerful about what you wrote, well, there were two things, right? First, if Sam Bahor, in Michael's essay and a number of the other essays, sort of enlighten people to the strategy of the occupation, like what it's there for, your essay serves almost as a catalog of the tactics of the occupation, right? At one of the many moments when my heart broke reading this book, right, you write that the Israeli High Court international bodies will often say the tactic being used is forbidden. And so, but the occupation, the IDF and the occupation authorities find ways around it, so that they're forbidden from waking up, as Yehuda was describing. You can't arrest a minor by going to his or her home at 3 o'clock in the morning and waking the family up and dragging the 13-year-old to jail. So you go at 2 in the morning and you issue a summons saying you need to show up. So for me, part of the power was you really make unavoidable the very mundane nature of these tactics. But the other thing that you do is that you interview really one of the most extraordinary people who I've ever met, and who you can come across, I think, in the pages of this kind of writing, who is a nonviolent activist. And it seems to me that, Rachel mentioned that you don't see the sort of emancipatory moment coming. And I agree in some respects, but when I read about what some of the nonviolent activists in the territories are doing right now, it seems to me that this is an extraordinary endeavor, right, with with consequences that we can't even imagine. I wonder if you could just say a minute about that, speak a minute about it before we go to questions.
Right. So my essay is about the military courts and specifically the prosecution of children. Children as young as 5 have been arrested by the Israeli army and prosecuted in military courts, 7, 8, 9, 10, frequently 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And so Issa Amro is the person you're talking about. And this is something you actually can do. And I would love it if you would all take out your phones and write this name, Issa Amro. Issa Amro is a nonviolent activist. And by nonviolent, I actually mean this is a man who pries the knives out of children's hands, children driven mad with desperation. And Issa gives them an alternative way to protest, to channel their energies. He gives them hope. He gives them structure. He gives them ideology. And he is terrifying to the Israeli government and to the military because, as the Israeli government has said, and we know this thanks to WikiLeaks, we don't do Gandhi very well. And so they are prosecuting Issa. I highlight in my essay an instance where they actually arrested a child purely as a way to try to convince that child to turn on Issa. They arrested and prosecuted and imprisoned a child to try to get that child to turn on Issa. And he is now facing charges right now, and 2 United States senators have written a letter in support of Issa, urging the Israeli government to drop the charges. And I would love it if you would all write your congressperson, write Kamala, write Dianne Feinstein, write, you know, everyone, Barbara Lee, she speaks for me and maybe for some of you, and others, and ask them to sign on to this letter urging them to drop the bogus charges against Issa Amro. So that's something you can do today.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to ask people with questions to Dan is there with the microphone, holding it high. Is that you, Dan? I can't.
Can I ask something too? You know, this is an issue a lot of people feel very strongly about. These are questions. You have Yehuda, Rachel, Fida on this. Please ask questions. I'm sure your opinions and your points and your thoughts and your soliloquies are very, very important. You can tell me later. Right now is a time for questions.
In fact, I have been instructed by the festival that they have a question-only policy this time around, even though we're here in Berkeley. So I think the organizers wanted people to line up here at the stairway. And you can ask questions. And if you end up making a soliloquy, monologue, or other kind of long-winded statement, they will just pull the microphone away. So please, and let's also remember this is one of the most difficult subjects to talk about. You have heard a lot of hard things today, but we are civil. We are Northern California, and if we can't have civil discourse on something hard, then it's terrible for the rest of the world.
I'm totally moved by all of your presentations, and I want your advice about how I should talk to my beloved niece who lives in Beitar Illit. What can I tell her? How can I convince her?
Thank you. Beitar Illit is a settlement in the West Bank.
Where my sister lives, my older sister.
Yeah, go for it.
None of the other ones want to answer it.
Yeah, as I said, my older sister lives there. And actually, even though I have a policy where I don't go to visit my friends who live in settlements, I do go and visit my sisters who live in settlements because, you know, family is family. I really don't know. Different people come from different backgrounds, believe in different, in different things and different set of values. For many years, I tried not to mix business and pleasure with my family. Because generally speaking, I'm against nuclear proliferation, and my politics and a Friday night dinner in my family is a nuclear explosion. So, so I usually only answer when I'm asked. It's only in the last year that what I tried to do is to bring my younger brothers and sisters to think about, to make the connection between what they feel as ultra-Orthodox Israelis within Israeli society, with some of the shaming about them, to try to bring, kind of like use the language that is used against ultra-Orthodox to open their eyes about the language they sometimes use against Palestinians. So it was like something like, all the Arabs are, and then I came to my brother and said, interesting, are you sure? How many Arabs do you know? What would you feel if someone would say all the ultra-Orthodox? I really don't know. I don't have an answer for you. It's just, you know him. You know them better than me, and it might be impossible. It might be possible. I don't know, really.
And it might not be your niece, it might be your niece's children. You know, we had an experience in Chabon where Michael asked me to go up to the young soldiers who were guarding us in the face of very, very aggressive, violent behavior on the part of the settlers, and to thank the soldiers, because to say to them that he recognized that they were in a shitty position, they didn't want to be there, that his presence there and the response of the very angry settlers made their lives a little more difficult. And I did that, and a young Israeli soldier said to me, "Tell him he's my favorite writer." And his commander got very angry and pulled him back. But then that young man and I, we communicate. He reached out to me over Facebook, and we emailed for a while. And I sensed pretty early on that he's a child of settlers. He grew up in a settlement. He's religious. That he is starting, because of his experience in Hebron, to question. So he was really using me as a sounding board. So what I did is I just answered his questions. I told him my point of view. I mean, it may not be your niece who is receptive to that, but if you are available as a person who is clear about what she believes and how her moral compass guides her, her children may one day come to you.
Just as a very brief tactical suggestion, an extraordinary phenomenon is happening a little under the radar screen on this side of the ocean, which is that almost every member of the highest ranking elite in the Israeli intelligence and military service, upon retirement, or if not almost all, then many, including the immediate past head of the Mossad, retire and then sound a lot like all of us up on the stage. And I find that when you can get people like your niece to look at what these people are saying, what Israeli commanders are saying about the occupation, that is a way to crack through cognitive dissonance.
I was wondering how the panel feel about those who say it shouldn't be called an occupation because that's a euphemism and should rather be called apartheid.
As someone who knows, yes, you asked that question.
I'm actually have 4 citizenships, which are South African, Israeli, Canadian, and American. So
Well,
I share with all of you up there.
Do you want to?
Well, I just want to say I asked this question like the morning that I arrived, and Yehuda told me an incredible story about when Barbara Hogan, right, came to do a tour of Breaking the Silence. Didn't you? Do you want to share what she
Tell
said?
that story, Yehuda.
No, there was a delegation from South Africa and that we took on tour, which they said it's under their perspective and what they've seen, they said that it's worse than apartheid. But I'll tell you the truth, I'm less interested in giving it a name. I'm not an historian of South Africa and the apartheid regime to try to compare. I'm not a legal scholar to try to compare. What I'm interested in is to talk about what really happens. You can give whatever title you want. It might be the fair one, it might not be. I'm really interested to talk about the details. I think one of the diseases of Western societies is that many times when we face a disease, when we face a problem, we give it a name, and we feel that we solved it just by giving it a title. Oh, yeah, that's apartheid, so let's move on, Oh, yeah, dehumanization, I'm more interested for us to kind of battle through the details, to be able to put the puzzle together. That's for me way more interesting than to give a title.
And I also think, I agree with that, and I think that those labels and naming things can also be used as a tool of silencing and of censorship, so that I call it the occupation, and then you say, from one perspective, you might say, you're using that term and it's mistaken, it's really apartheid, and I'm not going to listen to you because I don't like what you're calling it. Or from another side, it's not occupation, we have a right to be there, and it's, we're just fulfilling God's commandments, and I'm not going to listen to you because you're calling it an occupation. Or to call people, Jews who criticize Israeli policy become self-hating Jews, and non-Jews who criticize Israeli policy become anti-Semites. And these labels are they're really beside the point. They're just being used to silence people, to tell you, I don't have to listen to you because your language is not legitimate.
Yeah, I don't
Terrorist is another word that's used like that.
call it watermelon. Like, we're talking about a reality where millions of people have no civil rights, basic human rights, like, let's talk about the details.
Yeah, my board chair, Talia Sasson, who is a former state prosecutor of the state of Israel, when asked that question by a right-wing Israeli newspaper, said, it's plenty bad, exactly what it is bad enough, without running away to other conversations that we don't really want to have by labeling it.
This is exactly segueing into what my question was, which is, in the local Jewish newspaper, The J, there have been many letters to the editor putting the occupation in quotes, that Israel is not occupying the Palestinians because this is the land given to the Jewish people by God. And every time I read this, I feel like my brain is going to explode. So, I'm involved in several different anti-occupation Jewish groups, and including NIF, to which we contribute. But
Thank you.
What can we do who are against the occupation? We can demonstrate, like you're saying, Ayelet, but where? And how to be effective. I've got cousins
Fida,
who
do you
are,
want to try to...
so please answer. I need help with this. And it's not just going to meetings of people who think just like me. It's got to be a way of educating people who don't think like me or any of us.
I think, the first thing we have to do, I have to say that for me, it's very, very refreshing being among, such a crowd with so many Jewish friends and Jewish people in it who are, I was telling Daniel earlier, who are aware of, what's really going on, who try and make themselves more informed. I think what can be done, is huge, starting from local political, let's say, awareness, among people in certain areas, trying to take that up in the political system to political representatives and so on, trying to look at organizations that put pressure on Israel, whether through boycott or, other ways, encouraging people to come to Israel. Sam Bahur, whom Michael wrote about, receives, literally hundreds of Jewish delegations every year. These are people that know very little about the reality when they arrive, and he takes them on tours of the West Bank, and he shows them, he really, it's a very, very eye-opening experience for people. So to encourage, even other Jewish people, to encourage them to come and to see for themselves. What can be done in the States? The States, is one of the strongest supporters of Israel, morally, politically, and financially. Any pressure that the Jewish community can put on its elected representatives and, within the political sphere to try and lessen that blind support, at least while Israel is committing its crimes, is definitely the way to go. Because, I was having a discussion with someone earlier, just feeling bad about it obviously isn't enough. So thank you for the question.
This is for Daniel. The New Israel Fund is at a .org, and how do you contribute? Do you have to be a multimillionaire? What
Excellent
level?
question.
Do you want to answer?
It is a nonprofit. You can donate, and I urge you to. I want to just give you a little example of the kinds of things that the NIF has done for us personally. In addition to supporting this tour and supporting the book, there is an essay in the book written by the marvelous novelist Hari Kunzru. It's about, in part, a very aggressive, very violent, very litigious Israeli settler. And though we fact-checked, this book is impeccably fact-checked. It has tiers and tiers and tiers of fact-checking. And we were 100% sure that every word is accurate. But this man is a man who is frequently engaged in the project of slap suits. And though you guys might not know this, novelists don't make a lot of money. And it was frightening for this novelist to imagine being victimized by a litigious person with a propensity to slap suits. And he began to wonder whether maybe he should pull his essay from the book because of the possibility of being victimized by this. He's a man with small children. And Daniel, without missing a beat, stepped forward and said, the NIF has your back. And so the essay is in the book, and it was one of the most moving experiences for me in this project. That and meeting Fida, I think, count as two of the most moving experiences for me, because the NIF was there without question, with support, with firmness. And Daniel said something to me like, in these times, if we don't stand behind our allies, who are we? So get out your checks, go to the NIF website. It is
NIF.org.
Wow. And make a donation.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for that, Ayelet. I will say there's a nice addendum, a postscript. I don't know if I told you. The pro bono British lawyers with whom I connected Harry, we did a conference call to plan for what might happen. One of them was the lawyer who represented Deborah Lipstadt. You saw denial against David Irving. So you really get to stand on the right side of history when you stand with the New Israel Fund. And if you care about a future for Israelis and Palestinians, and within Israel, Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel together, if you believe in that idea that Israel, like the United States, can be something much better than it is right now, this is an organization where you can really support those Israelis and Palestinians who are working to make it so.
Hi. This is a bit of a rhetorical question, might even seem a little bit naive, but I want to ask it nonetheless. When is this all going to stop? I mean, it seems like one crisis after another.
Tomorrow. I mean, we published the book yesterday, so 48 hours, right? Right?
We've been asking ourselves that question for 100 years.
The great Israeli human rights lawyer, Michael Sfard, wrote an essay in Haaretz, I think, about a year ago.
Don't forget to get the book on your way out.
Get the book. And he wrote, he said, one day the occupation will end. And on the day that it ends, everyone in Israel will have been a Breaking the Silence supporter. All American supporters will have been NIF donors for many years. So one day it will end.
We're going to try to just get these last three people, but we only have a few minutes just to give you guys a heads up.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for this panel. It's been really interesting. A couple of things. Just one is just wanting to know, as an American, I mean, it's the support of the United States that's one of the main...
$4 billion a year.
Exactly. And, helping maintain the occupation. And that as Americans, American Jew, that... wanted to know what your thoughts about, the most successful way to be organizing, around that. And then the other thing is the established Jewish community is really busy with equating anti-Semitism with any kind of criticism of Israel at all, and it's striking on college campuses as well as in a lot of other places, and the need to really be supporting people on the campuses like UC Berkeley, San Francisco State, and many others.
I'm just going to ask what your question is.
So my question is how best to be attacking those attacks.
Do you want to take all three of the questions, and then we can sort of break them? Yeah.
My question is about accountability. You've described very precise terms about the occupation internally. How is Israel held accountable for their actions on the world stage? And is BDS a tactic to be able to level the playing field? I know I've heard criticism saying that you don't want to employ BDS because it harms the people on the ground who are trying to make a difference within Israel. And I'm more wondering if it's either one or the other, or if people who support BDS actually harm your efforts to try to make a difference inside.
Okay, let's get the last question, and then we can answer these.
Hi, excuse me for my poor English. I just got out of Gaza a few months ago, and I want to ask a question related to Yehuda point in regard to the present field. There is a place in the Israeli army called present field. This is, I think, what do you call it?
Yes, making your presence felt.
Yeah, we have to make the idea of presence felt in the Palestinian territories. During my experience in Gaza, I cannot imagine the sky without drones or the sky without the balloons that having all the most technical cameras that's filming our lives since I moved there. I was born in Syria, but my family ended up in some way in Gaza. And since I moved there, I'm feeling same as what he's describing of the present. So my question is to Ayelet and Michael to the point that they were saying we should boycott, like I support BDS for the settlements. Why a country establishing this crazy apartheid policy on community? Why we should boycott their settlements only? Because of there's like crazy reality that I'm not talking about politics. I'm not Palestinian. I don't consider me now as a Palestinian more than let's just think about someone who's have been living there and observing these situations. How through all these long years, all these millions still living under this like system or policy.
So these are connected questions.
Yeah, we can talk. I mean, I think we should just talk. It is really BDS. So let me start, and then Fida, and then Yehuda, and I think we all are on. Look, this is what I'll say about BDS. I'm confused. I am genuinely confused. Because here's the thing. Boycotts work. I saw them work when I was a tangential part of the anti-apartheid movement. There is no doubt that boycotts work. And for that reason, I boycott the settlements. As much as I love seltzer, and as hard as that particular aspect was, then they moved, I boycott the settlements. I don't buy anything made in a settlement. That's easy. BDS is a lot harder, and I do agree with people who say that there's anti-Semitism within BDS. That's true. Yehuda will talk a little bit more, I think, about BDS. But and this book would be in violation of the BDS boycott. And I don't think, I'm glad that this book is out. But I am genuinely confused because there are tactics that work, and there's also a moral imperative. So I am uncomfortably not taking a position, is maybe what I'll say.
I think an important point that I think.
Boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is a movement, 2005 movement that it's a tactic that tries to use the model of the anti-apartheid movement when it comes to Israel.
I think the gentleman raised an important question, and one that many Palestinians think of. Boycotting the settlements only is kind of like this whole room is on fire, and I'm just worried about this chair right here. The practices that we've spoken about today are practiced by the State of Israel. The settlements in the West Bank are only a tiny. okay, they're very impactful because they're in the West Bank and it's the occupation and so on. But it's the entire machine, the entire army, the machine, the government machine that perpetrates all this. And frankly, boycotting the settlements only isn't really going to cause them too much discomfort. So that's my stand.
Can I say something? Might as well speak out. From what I understand, BDS does not have a huge impact on the Israeli economy. And when I asked people there, actually I remember Yehuda saying to me that, in Brussels, decisions that are made by the EU could impact the occupation significantly tomorrow if they decided to change their trade relationship with Israel. Given that, though, symbolically, personally, I support the BDS movement, and I'm not ashamed to say that. I feel there's a kind of stigma, or people are afraid to admit that they might support it because of the way that the discourse has been shaped around it. But my books are published in Israel because I want people to be able to read, and I'm confused, as Ayelet is, when we look back at our formation politically through, I went to Berkeley, Stephen Biko Plaza is still there for me, and that process, the boycott of South Africa was a critical component of it. So I don't know with Israel, but for me, the whole state seems, frankly, untenable, and to need to be vastly and radically restructured. For me, it's not just the occupation. And when you ask very highly trained former Israeli soldiers who have joined Breaking the Silence about tactics and strategies of the Israeli military, they end up telling you that a lot of them were formulated not in 1967, in 1948. So for me, it's one very complex tapestry. And also, when you talk to middle-class Jewish people, I kind of sometimes worry that they use the settlement as a way of drawing a distinction of decency. Well, I'm not a settler. I'm not one of those radicals. But in fact, their life seems to be very much sustained by this continuing literal imprisonment of millions of people.
So I'm going to try to kind of like explain maybe my position on BDS, which is way more nuanced. My position to BDS comes from one of the foundations of my politics, which is the distinction between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli occupation. I don't believe, or I don't see Israel as just another pure white European colonial entity, stuck in the Middle East. I'm a Zionist. I believe Jews have a right to self-determination in the Holy Land. I just refuse to accept that the only way I will be allowed to fulfill my right to self-determination is if I strip my Palestinian neighbors from the exact same right that I want to myself. Now, I believe the conflict has two sides. And that's why it makes sense to me that we would want both sides to sit around the table of negotiations and end the conflict, rather than going out in the street and killing each other. We're not in 500 BC. We're in 2017. We should be able to do that. As opposed to the conflict, the occupation in my eyes has only one side. We occupy them. Why do Palestinians need to negotiate their freedom from us? Who the hell gave us a right for 50 years to keep them as hostages under military rule without rights and demand negotiations to end occupation even? That's for me unacceptable. Now, from this perspective, I come to BDS. If you would come to me tomorrow and say, I'll boycott settlements, I'll tell you, welcome to the club. I tried to do that for 13 years, if not even more. But I don't even see it as a boycott. I never go around and say, I don't steal from the grocery store in my neighborhood. No, it's not something that I waive. So I just, I try not to support stealing in that sense. If you would come to me and say, I will boycott entire Israel until Israel retreats to the Green Line, until the military regime over Palestinians end, you would put me in a corner which I will find very difficult to go against you. I might not support you because I'm an Israeli Jew and it's a bit weird for me to boycott myself. But your action is nonviolent. And that is important to say. Boycott is a nonviolent tactic. And sadly enough, I know many members in my government prefer Palestinians to resort to violence. I prefer not. And your political program will be a program that I support, full end of occupation. So I would find it very difficult to be against you. But that's where we get to the call of Palestinian civil society from 2005 for BDS and Israel until three things are fulfilled. One is Israel withdraws from all Arab territory it occupied, and it doesn't specify 48 or 67. Now, I understand the Palestinian narrative. I understand that for many Palestinians, if not for all of them, they see occupation starting in 48. But I'm from the other side in that sense. I cannot support this. Two, the second goal is full equality for Palestinians in Israel. By the way, this is something I fully agree with, but it's a conflict issue. And third is the implementation of the right of return of Palestinians. Again, a conflict issue. And that's why I cannot politically support the BDS movement. Because it's, in my eyes, it's not about the occupation, it's about the conflict. It's about shoving down my throat the Palestinian narrative of the conflict. That is something I would like us to negotiate over. Occupation, I call that it needs to end 50 years ago.
Okay, we are out of time. I want to thank the 5 of you for a really extraordinary panel. And I want to thank all of you for having such a productive, civil, and really collegial conversation about a very hard topic.
Everyone will be outside ready to sign books. Please buy 2. They're small. Put them in your pockets. Use them as doorstops. Whatever you're going to do, the money is going to Breaking the Silence and to Youth Against Settlements. Please, please, please support. And also, frankly, make HarperCollins happy that they made such a significant investment in the book. Thank you all.